In a quiet valley in the mountains of modern-day Kyrgyzstan, there's a cemetery with gravestones carved in the year 1338. One of them reads, in Syriac script, simply, "Died of pestilence." Whoever carved that stone had no idea they were documenting the opening scene of the deadliest pandemic in human history, 8 years before it had even reached Europe. And for over a century, historians had no real idea where it actually started. In 2022, that finally changed. A team of geneticists led by Maria Spiro and Johannes Krause pulled DNA out of the teeth of people buried in that Kyrgyz cemetery, people who had been in the ground for almost 700 years. What they found inside those teeth was a strain of plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, that turned out to be the direct ancestor of the strain that would go on to kill up to 60% of the population across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Historian Philip Slavin, who worked on the study, said it put to rest centuries of competing theories about where the Black Death began. It wasn't China. It wasn't the Caspian Steppe in general. It was almost certainly this one small trading community, sitting along the Silk Road, where the outbreak likely jumped from local marmots into humans in 1338, then rode merchant caravans west until it reached the Black Sea by 1346, and from there, by ship, into Europe. Here's a smaller, stranger detail while we're on names. Nobody who actually lived through it ever called it the Black Death. Contemporary writers called it the Great Mortality, or simply the Pestilence. The name we all use today wasn't coined until 1833, nearly 500 years later, most likely referring to the disease's grim reputation rather than any literal blackening of the skin, even though that symptom was real too. Here's the second thing you probably assume about the Black Death that turns out to be shakier than it sounds, that it was rats. In 2018, researchers led by Catherine Dean ran the actual outbreak data, mortality records from 9 different European cities, through a mathematical model comparing 3 possible ways the plague could have spread: rat fleas, airborne transmission, or fleas and lice living directly on humans. The rat model was too slow. It simply couldn't explain how fast the disease tore through crowded medieval cities. In 7 of the 9 cities, the pattern that actually matched the historical death records was human ectoparasites, meaning the fleas and lice already living on you and your neighbors, in your clothes, in your bedding. You could have avoided every rat in the city and still had no real way to protect yourself, because the plague, more often than not, was already crawling around on the person standing next to you in church. If you did get infected, the disease announced itself fast and unmistakably. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, living through the outbreak in Florence in 1348, described egg-sized swellings called buboes erupting in the groin and armpits, followed by black and purple blotches spreading across the skin, followed, in most cases, by death within 3 days. Boccaccio estimated the plague killed more than 100,000 people in Florence alone, over half the city. And he documented something else too. The people with the means to leave did. His most famous book opens with 10 young, wealthy Florentines fleeing the dying city for an isolated country villa, passing their quarantine telling each other stories to fill the time. The peasants who worked their land didn't have a spare villa to retreat to. They stayed in the city and took their chances alongside everyone else, and when a disease spreads that fast with no visible cause, people panic in very specific ways. Groups called flagellants, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, marched barefoot from town to town, whipping their own bare backs bloody with metal-tipped scourges in public squares, convinced that visible suffering would convince God to lift the plague. Crowds gathered to watch, and some joined in themselves. In practice, these were large groups of people traveling constantly between crowded towns and cathedrals, sharing lodging and clothing along the way, which was close to the worst possible transmission strategy anyone could have designed on purpose. The movement grew radical and politically threatening enough that the Pope formally condemned it in 1349. In many cities, panic curdled into something even darker. Rumors spread that Jewish communities had deliberately poisoned town wells, a conspiracy theory with no basis in reality, but one that led to mass killings of Jewish residents across parts of Europe, including a massacre in Strasbourg in 1349 that happened before the plague had even officially reached the city. Terrified people, with no explanation for what was happening to them, chose to manufacture one, and it cost real lives that had nothing to do with the disease itself. Out of that same panic came one idea that actually worked. The city of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, started requiring incoming sailors and traders to wait offshore for 30 days before entering the city, a rule other Mediterranean ports soon adopted and eventually extended to 40 days. The Venetian word for 40, quaranta, is where we get the word quarantine. It was based on guesswork, not germ theory, since nobody would understand bacteria for another 500 years, but it worked anyway, because distance and time are still the two things that stop a flea-borne disease, regardless of whether you understand why. For anyone who survived it, the plague did something almost nobody expects a mass death event to do. It gave ordinary people leverage they'd never had before. The Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of England's population in just a couple of years, which meant landowners suddenly found themselves competing for a labour force that had nearly been cut in half. Surviving peasants realised they could simply ask for more, and got it, or they packed up and walked to the next estate over, where a desperate lord was quietly offering better terms and conveniently not asking too many questions about where they'd come from. Wages jumped so fast that in 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, a law that made it a criminal offence to pay, or accept, wages higher than pre-plague levels. By most contemporary accounts, it failed almost completely. Landowners desperate for workers paid the higher rates anyway and just didn't report it, and the resentment the law created among labourers who were arrested or fined for asking to be paid more helped fuel the peasants' revolt 3 decades later, in 1381. Historians now generally treat this moment as one of the opening cracks in feudalism itself, a system that depended entirely on land being scarce and labour being cheap, running headlong into a world where suddenly, for the first time in living memory, it was the other way around. So if you'd survived those years, your daily life afterward would have been genuinely strange to sit with. You'd have watched entire families vanish from your village within days, without you or anyone else having the faintest idea why or where it had actually come from, since that answer wouldn't arrive for another 675 years. You might have watched neighbours turn violently on people who had nothing to do with any of it, while the wealthy simply left for the countryside until it passed. And then, if you made it through, you might have found yourself, for the first time in your family's history, able to walk into a landowner's estate and simply demand better pay, because for once there weren't enough people left alive to say no. This is episode 5. Next up, what it was actually like living as an outlaw, or just an ordinary settler in the American Wild West. Subscribe if you want to catch it, and if this series is your kind of thing, a like genuinely helps.